Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter, and with me today is Courtney Stewart. Courtney, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing good, thanks. And we have with us today also Landon Noll. Landon, how are you?
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time zone and latitude from your friendly secular astronomer. And it's a pleasure, Courtney, and it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Nicholas, as well, for inviting me on.
My pleasure. It's always good to have you. So, we're here today to discuss. And I think it's an interesting. There's always people who don't necessarily know or understand why DC statehood is an issue or what kind of issue it is. But last week, the uh, House of Representatives in the United States voted 232 to 118, with every single Republican and one Democrat voting against, for the declaring the District of Columbia a state. That would make it the 51st state in the Union. There are a number of people who don't realize that Washington, D.C., in fact, is not a state. It is a district. And there are 5 other areas that are either territories or in some way just not quite a state, don't have the same rights as other states, have all the same responsibilities, but not necessarily the same rights. So that's what we're here to discuss. We will have later, let's see, on Thursday and Friday, we will be discussing 3 new studies on the correlation between what people watch and specifically what Fox News programs they watch and COVID numbers, how rapidly they seem to get COVID. So that should be interesting. But for now, we have on Landon. And Landon, what do you think? This is now, it's passed in the House of Representatives. Is it going to get through the Senate?
Probably not in the current Senate in the current form, but this is an issue that has been around for a very long time. It's been around for at least 237 years. So the fact that it's going to take a little bit longer is not historically unusual. The fact that it's an issue is certainly unusual with regards to the the whole matter. But we need to go back to, and this is back to understanding history and the Constitution, why is Washington D.C. Not a state? People think it's the capital. Yes, but if you are a resident of Washington D.C., you have no member of Congress, as you have no House of Representatives representing you. You have no senator representing you. Your city is managed by Congress. Your police is managed by and local security is managed by the president. And you're in this odd situation of being taxed, but not being represented regarding that taxation. So you're going to say, well, why is it? Why is it that the country that one of its early slogans rebelling against the Whigs and the Tories and their craziness in the former United Kingdom, why is it that they had this slogan of no taxation without representation when members of our capital do not have representation? Is it considered, some people will say it's ironic that we rebelled, but the people that live in our capital district do not have representation?
Well, to be fair, they do. They have one. They do have one representative. That representative can't vote on the floor, but they've got a representative. They can vote in committee.
Well, if the committee permits. And
Yeah.
So yes, they have what we might consider to be an observer, who, if under the rules, is permitted to say things, but is not permitted to actually participate. And now it for a long time they couldn't even vote for electors. But why is this? Why is it that DC is special? Well, in 1783 there was actually a crowd of soldiers of the Revolutionary War that were supposed to be paid and weren't getting paid. Right? This this notion of mistreatment of veterans and not living up to promises of veterans is a very long-standing problem in the United States. And 1873, when you had Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, there was a bunch of soldiers basically blocked the doors and refused to let the delegates leave until they got paid. And they tried, the Congress tried to get Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, to use their militia to deal with this, quote, unruly mob. And Pennsylvania said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to go and harass this mob. So what did Congress do? It was, quote, forced to abruptly adjourn to New Jersey. Now, some people, jokes aside, people say, well, the fact that it's forced to go to New Jersey was one of the things that led to notion of that, and in particular, it was Madison in particular, stated that Congress needed to be in control over the Capitol, right? They did not want the local state that the capital had to be in to have unusual power. They did not want the local state to be able to tax people traveling to and from Congress and other sorts of things. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution says, the Congress shall have the power to exercise legislation in all cases whatsoever over the district, not exceeding 10 miles square, as may by session of particular states and acceptance of Congress to become the seat of the government in the United States. So what the Constitution said was, wherever the capital is, the district, and it can't be more than 10 miles square, it is going to be Congress, not a state, controlling over the capital area. And then, and Madison, in writing the Federalist Papers, which essentially was an argument for the Constitution. We had this failed Confederacy and we wanted a new Constitution. Even said, well, that the people of this new federal district will have their voice in government.
It actually said that originally.
No, the Federalist Papers, Madison said they'll have their voice in government, but never actually explained how. And I think it was sort of something facts that was lost. So there was a case in 1788 that the state of Maryland ceded the district in there. And there's also things about, where there was called a Residence Act, where the Potomac River between Worcester and Ridge was ceded, and it actually was President George Washington that actually selected the exact location on January 24th, 1791. And so the Residence Act actually amended to include some land that Virginia had ceded. That land was later returned to Virginia, and so they ended up. But Congress actually didn't literally move the capital until December 1800. And that time was sort of was a board of directors that ran it. But it ended up having the District of Columbia Organic Act of 1801 that actually incorporated it as a federal district. And since then, District of Columbia has not been part of any state. The district's residents lost representation in Congress. They were unable to vote for electors for the president, and that was actually, it started immediately in 1801. Presidents saying, "Hey, wait a minute, what do you mean? We seceded against Great Britain from being taxed without representation, and now, and of course, even then the people in Parliament, House of Commons would say, well, the colonists will have members in the House of Commons who look out after the best interest. But they did not have actual members. Same sort of thing we did. We basically did the same thing to us that King George did. And so there's been basically a number of attempts, quite a number of attempts. In fact, if you look at the number of bills and the number of proposed constitutional amendments, been over 150 constitutional amendments and bills that have been introduced to try to get representation in District of Columbia in one of several ways. I don't know if you have any comments here, but I'll move on to the 19th and 20th century. But that's some of the initial founding problems that occurred.
So DC was set up as a district, independent of any state, so that the government couldn't be interfered with by the local state politics. If you had a local police force, if you had the local, so it would be managed all on its own. But
yes,
certainly, at least when it started, too, because states are afforded the right to have delegates in a presidential election. States are awarded senators and representatives. Nobody said anything about districts. Nobody said anything about these special circumstances. So the Constitution did not provide for them to have any. Now, they're still Americans. They still can be drafted into the military. They still have to pay all their taxes.
They still have to pay taxes, yes.
Okay, so they are American citizens in all respects. And if they are born there, they are born in the United States. So they can still run for president. They're 100% American citizens, but they don't have any of the advantages that comes with being in a state. So are we? I think we're. So that's it so far. Yes, Courtney.
So the original intent was so that a state wouldn't impede on like federal issues.
Yes, in the argument.
So is that because like?
Imagine if the state decided they're going to have their own National Guard and militia to go and keep people from entering the Capitol, and they decided to, mess with the government, or that state becomes more powerful, right? The original colonies were worried about this balance of power, and having a state having the capital might make that state feel as if they were running the show.
Yeah.
And then you'd have state police or local police would be actually the police of two different things. They'd be the police of that state, but they'd also be the police of the capital. So I think the idea was to sort of try to tease those two things out, but they didn't take into account the fact that the Constitution doesn't actually allow a mechanism whereas if you have a separate entity, they have
And literally, the area was a swamp. There wasn't really much.
That's what I was going to say. Is that it's probably geographically was a very different situation where the area they designated was only going to encompass like the capital and people dealing with official issues. It wouldn't have encompassed citizens who live there as residents. That would be my assumption. So that's interesting. So what if they just like made that square footage smaller and keep the original intent?
Well, of course, the question is that the question is how do you handle that? I mean, and before we go, there's a whole number of proposals, and something like that has been proposed as well that they've been talking about.
That would make sense to me.
Remember, the situation is that Congress has the power over the district, and so what, and that the whatever it was that states would cede that territory to the capital. So the technically part of DC was given to the capital by Maryland, part of it, and Virginia as well. So there's an argument that essentially it's on permanent loan, if you will, from Maryland, but Maryland does not have the rights over it. Congress does. And that's one of the things that is kind of imagine if you want to get potholes fixed or an additional school or to do a road, and you've got to get Congress to do that for you. And not Congress you vote for that you can go, but you've got to get a collection of Congress members throughout the country to vote in majority. That's a big problem, right? You have to sort of lobby to get Congresses to actually pass something and the president to sign that bill in order to get something as simple as more money for potholes or changing a name of a street or what have you, right? It's the so it's more than just simply they don't have members of Congress. They have to deal with the entire Congress and it's subject to whatever Congress's whim is and the president's whim. So There's, first proposal for actual serious proposal for statehood came in 1888, and and it was a bill introduced by a senator from Washington, actually.
Mhm.
A report out of committee that would have given it representation, but it did not. It did not. So it would have basically treated the resident DC as though they were citizens of the state, but wouldn't really handle the representation problem. Now, in the civil rights era, they passed the 23rd Amendment. The 23rd Amendment gave the citizens of DC the right to elect electors. So we went from 535 to 538.